All right, it's live on YouTube now, and we can start, Pak Diki.
Please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your coming. Welcome to Wednesday Forum. This is a weekly discussion that is held by both the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies (CRCS) Master's Program at the Graduate School of Gadjah Mada University, and the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, a consortium of 3 universities in Jogja, Gadjah Mada University, Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University, and Duta Wacana Christian University. And this is the first of this semester. We already have our speaker today here in the Zoom, Dr. Diki Sofian, a core faculty member at the ICRS Jakarta, and he earned his PhD at the National University of Singapore. He is a member of the Educational Exchange Committee at the American Indonesian Exchange Foundation, and he has been writing a lot of articles related to religious studies, religious freedom, religious literacy, religion and politics, and so on. And he will be speaking about the role of religious literacy in combating conservatism. I believe that this presentation is partly derived from his recent publication at the Journal of Religions about the Ministry of Religious Affairs program on religious literacy. So, Pak Diki, I believe that you already know the rule: 45 minutes maximum for presentation, and then the next 45 minutes for questions and answers later. For those of you who are watching via YouTube or you are in Zoom, you can write down your questions or comments on the chat box, or if you prefer to speak, I will let you later during discussion to turn on your video and you can start speaking then. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pak Diki Sofian.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Aziz. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you all. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Rahayu, Rahayu, Rahayu. I'm very delighted to be here today with you all, especially filling up this first Wednesday forum session for this semester in ICRS, CRCS. Although it's unfortunate we cannot be together physically, but I'm sure that this would not lessen the engagement that we could have this afternoon. So I'm delighted here to talk about our 3-year project on religious literacy, and I'm also very happy that we have Pak Leo Epaphras here and Mbak Ida and some others who had been involved quite intensely with the program on religious literacy. So the title of my presentation this afternoon is Religious Literacy in the Sea of Conservatism. So this was really based on our 3-year work with the Ministry of Religious Affairs, namely the Research, Development and Training Program, the Litbang Diklat in Jakarta, but also engaging many religious extension officers across the country. This presentation will mostly be based on an article which I wrote recently and published by the Journal of Religions, entitled Learning About Religions, an Indonesian Religious Literacy Program as a Multifaith Site for Mutual Learning. So this was just published in late August 2020. But I must say that there are still ongoing discussions with the Ministry of Religious Affairs on how we could extend the project somehow. So as an introduction, I'd just like to provide you with some background and context, because as we discuss religious literacy, it is always important for one to establish the context or the environmental factors, as some would call it, why religious literacy is important, why it could be strategic, and why is it perhaps more urgent to be conducted than anywhere else. In terms of the theoretical terrain, I have highlighted this in the article as well. But essentially, what we mean by religious literacy here, I mean, literacy is a very generic term. And I think if any of you are familiar with the term, it really relates more toward this idea and understanding about the basic competencies in life, or the basic abilities in how to function in a society. And to function in society, a person must be able to read, to write, and to do some basic mathematical calculations. That's the idea of the generic term of literacy, meaning to say that it would be very difficult for anyone to be living in a society without being able to read, to write, or to do basic mathematical calculations, right? Because then he or she would be having some difficulties in going to the groceries, in buying food, buying commodities, and being able to engage people. And now that we have emails, WhatsApps, Facebook, social media, and so on, of course, this idea about digital literacy comes to the fore. But so what are we talking then when we say religious literacy? So I guess this is where the main thrust of the program is really, and the research and the thinking behind this program. And that is, what is our level of religious literacy? I mean, I have seen the data for Indonesia in terms of the literacy level, and it's not very good. If you compare Indonesia with a country like India, for instance, we are by far very low in terms of our literacy rate, in terms of how many books we read, how many pages of articles we read. Yeah, I mean, we've got data on that. And of course, this has significant implications in terms of the learning outcome and in terms of the all kinds of indices with respect to the Indonesians' level of competency in academia, in academic performances. Yeah, and it seems like this has to a certain extent also influence the Human Development Index that we have, which is constantly going down in terms of the ranking among nations. So the idea about religious literacy is not to study religion or to learn religion, but it's more about studying about religion and learning about religion. Meaning to say, I mean, the instrumental term here, or the word that is central, is about. Yeah. So instead of studying religion or learning religion, it's really studying about religion and learning about religion. Meaning to say that we are not studying religion from the normative aspect. We are not learning religion from the top down, not from the sort of doctrinal perspective or theological perspective, but we are really looking at, first and foremost, the sort of diversity within religion. And I think this is one of the main sort of assumptions that we have with respect to religious literacy. It's also to a certain extent related to cultural literacy, and cultural literacy has been very much in use when people started going overseas, and globalization started to unfold, and the industry of tourism started to boom, and we saw a lot of people who were culturally illiterate. Yeah. So one of the arguments I would say later on is that this religious literacy could also be an antidote to conservatism and radicalism. Yeah. But I will talk more about that later on. But our program, our 3-year program, specifically engaged the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And as we know, within the context of Indonesia, you know, we are, there is a sort of this pervasive Muslim privilege within the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And I guess this has been one of the raison d'etre for the establishment of the ministry itself. And that is that, you know, it was, after all, one of the outcomes of the political negotiations between the Muslim political camps and the non-Muslim political camps. And of course, some of the more conservative political camps, Muslim political camps, wanted to establish an Islamic state, but yet the Ministry of Religious Affairs was institutionalized also to sort of negotiate the hard deliberations between commissions of the state in the early establishment of the Republic. And within the Ministry of Religious Affairs, there is a function called the Penyuluh Agama, or within the international parlance, it would be called extension officers. We have extension officers also in the Ministry of Agriculture, right? And hence they are also extension officers of the Ministry of Agriculture, right? And so it's not the only ministry that has a wide network of extension officers. So the Ministry of Religious Affairs has around 115,000 extension officers from across the country, across the archipelago, who are based essentially at the sub-district level, at the kecamatan level. Yeah. And not more than 5% of them are civil servants, yeah, pegawai negeri sipil. The rest are what we call honorary state employees, yeah, tenaga honorer negara. So this was one of the, I guess, significance of the idea of the religious literacy program in Indonesia, because we really engaged the Penyuluh Agama, which we saw as the frontliners of the spreading and dissemination of religious messages across the country. And I think, to be honest, we have been, in my view, ignored their presence and the centrality of their work for many decades. And so I guess this program was sort of an attempt to also bring them into the mainstream discussions about how we can mitigate this problem, this rising tide of conservatism and radicalism in society. I also have my own personal reasons for liking this program, for initiating this program. In addition to being born and raised here in Indonesia, in Jakarta, I was also raised and schooled in Sydney, Australia, and London. And in London, when I did my junior and secondary school, I had the chance to study what they call religious education, or RE. You see, and it was interesting for me in the religious education classes, I would learn about Islam, I would learn about Judaism, Baha'ism, even Rastafarianism, Hinduism, and so on and so forth. So almost each week, we would have the teacher of religious education invite imams to talk about Islam, rabbis to talk about Judaism, and priests and ministers, and so on and so forth. So I grew up and was schooled from a very early age to a sort of a multi-religious form of education, which I think appreciate more, because as you know, in Indonesia, we don't have such luxury. For Muslims, we are only, if you go through the stream of education from kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, high school, up until university, if you happen to be Muslim, then you would only be learning about Islam. If you're Catholic, you would only have the access to learn about Catholicism and Christianity, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucianism and whatnot. So the main argument for this program and for this research is really to look at the insufficiency of Indonesia's mono-religious education. I mean, we like to pride ourselves of being a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society, but yet our education system is still mono-religious. And this remains to be a problem, I think, and continues to be one of the most problematic areas and sectors in society, I think, which to a certain extent also contribute to the rising tide of conservatism and radicalism. And with the increasing influence of the religious transnational movements, oftentimes we are, forgetful about our own context in terms of the multi-religious society that we are living in. And I would also like to argue that religious literacy helps build democratic citizenship, because with the training and the learning about religions, then one would obviously be much more attuned to the ideas of civility, pluralism, tolerance, multiculturalism, and so on and so forth, than if one were only exposed to his or her own faith tradition without having the access, more opportunity to learn about other religions. So my argument in the article was to say that this religious literacy program has become a multi-faith site for mutual learning. And I say mutual learning because I think there are three processes in which I argued in my article where mutual learning takes place. One is between and among the religious extension officers. What we found out was there are many religious extension officers in each of our kecamatan's, sub-districts, and mayoralties and districts. But it's funny that, the Muslim religious extension officers are usually not aware of who are the Christian or Catholic religious extension officers while they're operating in the same locality, in the same kecamatan or the same kabupaten or mayoralty or province, rather. And so to me, this seems rather ironic to think that, religious communities are all facing more or less the same kind of challenges. I mean, with respect to conservatism, I would argue that virtually all of the religious communities are facing more or less the same kind of challenges. And with respect to the politicization of religion, for instance, and the religious illiteracy that engulfs many of the religious faith communities in Indonesia, but yet they are not in contact with each other. And I know the reason why. One of the reasons is because these religious extension officers operate within their own respective communities. And so it's a very top-down kind of state affair, if you like, because these religious extension officers are within what's called the Bimas Masyarakat, community guidance from each of the respective faith traditions. So you have Bimas Islam, Bimas Kristen, Bimas Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucianism. And they all fall under these different categories. And so when they operate in their own localities, in their own context, they're not able to even know who are the extension officers from the Muslim side or from the Hindu side or from the Buddhist side. And so this has been one of the contributions of our program, and which is, I argued, which is to break down these silos and break down these silent walls of separation that separate the religious extension officers from one another. Because as I mentioned, all of the religious communities are facing more or less the same kind of problems and issues. I will talk about that more later on. The other thing is that there is a sort of a sense of not being confident enough, on the part of the religious extension officers. And many of these religious extension officers whom we have engaged and talked to have told us that they don't seem to be confident enough to compete against the so-called celebrity ustads or ustazas, or the celebrity ministers or pastors who are very famous, influential in YouTube, in Facebook, in social media. And so this religious literacy program is really also an attempt to inject some passion and enthusiasm in their work so that they can be more confident in the way they articulate their work and their roles, and how they can be more strategic in their dissemination of religious messages. And so we have used a religious literacy program to also get them to know other societal actors, namely the religion teachers and the NGO activists, the women's activists, the youth activists, and so on, so that they can have a much broader understanding about the problems, issues, and challenges that their society is facing. And then the third mutual learning aspect is where ICRS comes in. I mean, ICRS being a center of excellence for interreligious studies, we need to also learn from others. I was just discussing yesterday about this idea of knowledge production. There is no more knowledge production nowadays. What we have is knowledge co-production. There's not one single actor in society that can claim that they dominate or monopolize the production of knowledge. Not the university professors, not those who are in research think tanks, not the government, not the businesses, corporations, not civil society, not anyone. I think each and one of these actors and societal agencies, institutions have their own ways of knowing, including local communities, indigenous communities, and so on. So I think we need to get our heads around this idea of co-production of knowledge, so that we in academia don't think that we monopolize knowledge and that we should be dominating the discourse and so on. So for us in ICRS, we also learned quite a bit from our engagement with the Ministry of Religious Affairs, with the extension officers, and all of the strategic groups that we engaged. The program itself, one of the initial processes in which took place was my conversation with some people from the British Council, friends from the British Council, which led to our discussion and meeting with His Excellency, the ambassador, the British ambassador to Indonesia, Muazzam Malik, who happens to be Muslim and of Pakistani descent. And we talked about the idea of how we can infuse the idea of social justice, tolerance, multiculturalism, and so on. And so one of the things that we suggested was that the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, which is the Penyuluh of the United Kingdom, and the British Embassy and British Council support us in this program on religious literacy. And we also promised that there would be structural policy changes within MORA with respect to the religious extension officers, and that we would ultimately be also in support of the minister's own, or even President Jokowi's own idea about moderasi beragama, yeah, which has been one of the main national programs which has been established by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. In terms of the program, we had 3 phases for each year. So we had the inception workshop, the module development, stakeholders engagement, training, evaluation. In phase 2, we did a strategy workshop, module development again, and we established a training of trainers so that we can get those who participated during the first phase to become trainers for our religious literacy program. And we also facilitated some cascading workshops and did an evaluation assessment. The third one relates to the uji sahih, or the validity testing, which was quite, I would say, rigorous by the Ministry of Religious Affairs, together with the Widya Iswaras, or the trainers within the Diklat section of the ministry. And the program ultimately ended in the acceptance of the Ministry of Religious Affairs and the adoption of our religious literacy module that would be used as a way to build capacity for the religious extension officers across the country. So one of our current thinking now is how we can perhaps translate this religious literacy module into some sort of a massive open online course, or MOOC, so that the religious literacy program would not have to be done physically and face-to-face, but could be done via, internet and technological platforms. So essentially, we trained around 850 religious counselors, teachers, activists from 6 cities. And this does not include the Widya Iswaras, the trainers, the researchers who attended the validity testing, the uji sahih workshops, which we conducted perhaps 4 or 5 times in 4 or 5 different cities in Indonesia. So altogether, I think there were at least around 1,000 to 1,100 people who were exposed to our religious literacy program and module before it was adopted by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. In terms of the beneficiaries, we still saw that the Penyuluh Agama, the extension officers, were the ones who mostly got the benefits out of the training and workshops. And this was intentional. And it was also, within the interest of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. These are just some of the activities held in Ambon, in Tebing Tinggi, North Sumatra, Manado, and elsewhere. The module itself, we intended this module to be interreligious in nature, and hence engaging different faiths and traditions. You must understand that when it comes to religious literacy, oftentimes, by definition, it entails the knowledge of the text, of scriptures, and so on. So what we have done in the module is to incorporate some of these religious and sacred texts and scriptures into the modules. So we've got Quranic, verses, we've got hadith, we've got prophetic tradition, we've got the sayings of Jesus, we've got, sections from the Bible and from other sacred texts. So the idea for the module is to have a module that really talks about the maslahah, the public concerns, the public issues, the common problems confronted by the religious communities, as I mentioned earlier. We've got the problem of the environment, we've got the problem with internet, social media, we've got the problem with the politicization of religion, and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned, that all of these modules and all of the content, word by word, paragraph by paragraph, was validated by the people from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So it was a very rigorous and intense process in which we did with the people from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. These were some of our the main actors who are behind the content of our modules, our trainings, from 4 or 5 different provinces and from different schools and faith traditions and so on. This was the module in which we did. Initially, we had around 6 or 7 subsections in the module for religious literacy, but then ultimately 4 made it into print for the adoption of the Minister of Religious Affairs. I think I know why this occurred, but then, if you're interested, I can elaborate more. But this is how it went in terms of the development of the module for religious literacy. This was the ambassador who spoke at our religious literacy cascading workshop in Bandung, which was, reported by a lot of media, because the Minister of Religious Affairs also came, and of course, the British ambassador, and also the head representative of British Council. And we had a number of religious extension officers and researchers also participating in this program. This was an article I did when I went to the European Academy of Sciences conference, where I was asked to write about the religious literacy program. So apparently the Italians were also very interested. The overall European Union was very interested in the idea of religious literacy. One of the arguments they said was that, and I believe this to be true, is that the Islamophobia and the anti-Semitism that have been engulfing Europe is partly caused by religious illiteracy. And so this has been one of the arguments that I have made in Italy, and was published by Corriere della Sera newspaper, if you know that this is one of the top newspapers in Italy. So thank you very much. Terima kasih. Matur sukma. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you, Pak Diki, for your presentation. And yeah, I think there will be many things to discuss here. And I will let people who want to ask questions or comment. If you want to speak, I will let you to speak. And if you prefer to send your questions via text, you can write down your questions in the chat box in Zoom, or for people who are watching via YouTube, you can write down your questions on the comment sections of our YouTube channel. So, are there any people here who want to ask or comment?
I may start, Mas Aziz.
Yeah, please.
Oh, fotoku jelek. Okay, thank you very much, Mas Diki. Thank you very much, Mas Aziz. Mas Diki, thank you very much for the very detailed presentation about the program. That is very insightful of thinking about how to engage with the religious communities. I was actually wondering, Mas Diki, if you could also share about the challenges like you encountered during the trainings, having some experiences, encountering those religious followers of different religions. They often came up with like a sensitive issues. So did ever appear in your experiences, working with them, like the sensitive issues that they were concerned, and then they brought up, and how that, influence the forum, and how you managed it, and the other one, just to follow up, like after this program, you have already the model. Those for whom, like, how do you, to what targets, like the modules, are brought to, like whom the target for the model to apply to use. Thank you, Mas Ajis. Thank you, Mas Diki.
Yeah, you can answer directly.
Oh, okay. Well, we confronted quite a bit of challenges, to be honest with you, and there were, of course, many people who challenged even the notion of literacy, religious literacy, had come to the fore. Yeah, and hence this was one of the reasons why we changed the sort of the heading of the Bahasa Indonesia module into something fairly different. Yeah, because if we were to translate religious literacy, that would mean literasi keagamaan. And I guess for some people, they have this misconception that, I know about my own religion, I know about religion, so why would I have to undergo this training, for what reason, and so on. So there is that sort of misconception that, religious literacy in a religious country has no basic function, no strategic urgency, right? But this is where the misconception lies, I think. And this is the whole idea about why religious literacy is important. Because it's not just knowing about your own faith tradition, but it's also knowing some basic information about the faith tradition of others, so that you can at least respect and appreciate what they believe in or what they don't believe in, right? And I think this has been one of the, I would argue, this is one of the reasons why people are drawn into radicalism, into conservatism. Remember, in conservatism, there is this general belief that, that truth only comes from one source. And usually that's their own faith tradition, right? Whether you be Muslim or Christian, Catholic, Jews, or Baha'i, or so on, you tend to think that only your religion provides salvation, right? Of course, in the Quran, for instance, Inna Dina Indallahil Islam. Oftentimes, this verse is interpreted to say that only Islam is the religion that will receive salvation from God, right? And the same thing with Christianity, right? That only through Jesus that salvation could come, right? And so on and so forth. So that's the whole idea about religious literacy. It's the idea that you not only be familiar with your own faith tradition, but that you also try and attempt to learn about the basic information and the basic understanding and frameworks of other religions. And so I think this is where my personal experience, as I mentioned earlier, in London, in the British public school, taught me, that, there are many banyak jalan menuju Roma, we say, right? There are many roads that lead to Rome, we say. And I think in Sufism, you would also find a lot of these allegories and so on that would talk about these things. Even, the mystic poet, Maulid Rumi and so on, talks about these different pathways toward salvation, pathways toward God, and so on and so forth. So that's religious literacy. So it's not so much learning your religion and knowing your text well and so on, and your rituals, but it's also getting to know others as well. And so I think that was one of the main challenges. And hence what we did was, we did not translate that religious literacy into literasi keagamaan, but we changed it into something like workshop, what is it, Pak Leo? Workshop wacana agama dan keberagaman. So it's a workshop on enrichment workshop. Enrichment workshop on religious diversity and so on. So it's a way to sort of get around this idea that, oh, we are already familiar with our religious traditions. Thank you. and we don't need your religious literacy program. So that was the idea. Secondly, of course, there were many hotspot areas as well where we conducted the religious literacy program, including in Ambon. I mean, as you probably know, Ambon is a post-conflict province and area where there are still tension between and among the Muslims and Christians, most notably. And during the workshop, we did sense that there was still that tension, you know, but when we brought the issues to things like religion and the internet, or religion and ecology, and environmental degradation, and religion, human dignity, you know, everyone, you know, came together, because these are some of the things and issues in which no religion would deny. I mean, no faith communities would deny to have problems and challenges with, right? And so that was, I guess, another sort of strategic entry points in where we can get these various religious communities to come together and to talk about the common issues and problems using their own perhaps unique religious lenses and perspectives. We also tried as much as possible, to the best of our ability, to negotiate with the Ministry of Religious Affairs to also include other religious people from outside of the 6 formal religions in Indonesia. I don't think we successfully did that, or we didn't really do that quite successfully. We did at some point get some participants from kepercayaan and from other faiths. And we also had some members from Ahmadiyya and Shia to be included in our both training and workshops, as well as the training of trainers. And so they were also included in our cascading workshops and training. So what next? As I mentioned, I would love to make this module into a MOOC, so that all of the extension officers could, or at least the ministry could use this MOOC or module to sort of be one of the requirements for the religious extension officers if they were to want to be promoted to a higher position or a higher pangkat, if possible. Thank you for your question.
Okay, Pak Diki, there is one question in the chat box from Leaket Ali. I believe he is an alumnus of ICRS. He says, thank you very much for the presentation. I did my first semester at the University of London and I was exposed to religious literacy. I thought back then it's very important. Would like to ask on how did you come up to those modules? What about the issues of radicalism? With that glance that you gave on the presentation, I can see. I think it's about how would you define radicalism. And I think following up this question, you may also clarify your definition or understanding of what conservatism is, Pak Diki. Yeah.
Shukran. Assalamualaikum, Ya Ustad. Kaifal? Thank you very much for your question. This is my student from Singapore. So he's an imam and ustad, and he works a lot with the government of Singapore for de-radicalization of radicals in the prisons in Singapore. So we have a lot in common in terms of our thinking and our work. And yes, it was quite a challenge for us to ultimately determine what sections or what subjects would be relevant for a religious literacy program for all of the religious communities in Indonesia. But I think we were very clear in terms of the basic framework and understanding of it. And that is to look at the common challenges of the religious communities and tease out some of the issues that they think would probably be one, problematic, most problematic to them, and secondly, even sensitive to them. Yeah, and so this was when we decided, let's talk about religion and the state. We discovered that that was quite acceptable to many of them, because this issue of politicization of religion has come to fore in many religious communities in Indonesia. It's not just the Muslims, but it's also the other religious communities. Yeah, and that is how people and politicians have been using religion to mobilize adherence to a certain, oftentimes very narrow political objectives, right? And so that's the idea of politicization of religion. And hence we thought that it might be quite strategic for us to talk about this and get them to think about how their religious communities thought about politics and thought about the state. And one of the major issues, as you probably know, is what comes first? Does the state come first, or does religion come first? And when you ask religious people that question, you will have very interesting answers and responses, right? If Muslims were asked this, which is more important, the Sharia or the positive law, right? So this would obviously be a dilemma for many very conservative Muslims, especially the radicalist Muslims, right? Because for them, the positive national laws would be amount to shirk, right? Would be amount to oghur, right? Partnering Allah, right? And would be outside of their sort of faith commitments, right? So it's these kinds of problems, and apparently the same kind of problem is confronted with the Christian communities and the Catholics, whether they think the Vatican has more power over Jakarta, for instance, right? These are very, urgent, important, and yet very highly sensitive issues. And I think many of these subjects are not being discussed publicly, because I think as we experience it, it took us quite a long time to consider who would be the best person to give training on such and such subject, right? Because if you get the wrong trainer to talk about sensitive issues, then everything can fall apart. Yeah, and based on our own experience, to be frank with you, we've had our ups and downs. We've made some good choices, but also some not so good choices in terms of our trainers. So the module and the trainer, they are both very important for you to consider if you're developing a religious literacy program, because what the text says and how the trainers talk about it and present it may have different implications and consequences. Yeah. So with respect to radicalism, that was one of the entry points that we did. So we didn't really go into the issue of radicalism per se, but we went through this idea about what is the relationship between religion and the state. How do you think about religion and the state? What do you think about the idea of legal pluralism, for instance, right? Where you have Islamic law, and then you have the national positive law, and you have the adat law, and so on. How do you deal with these different laws and legal frameworks? And we had very open and frank discussions with all of the people and representatives from the religious communities. And you must remember that these religious extension officers are religious extension officers because of one thing, because they are knowledgeable about their religion. Yeah, they are trained in the religious sciences, in the religious knowledge. Some of them have degrees from UIN, from EIN, yeah? Some of them from theological schools, from seminaries, and so on. So these are not people who are blank, you know. These are people who are very familiar with the terrain, very familiar with their own theologies, with their own rituals, with their own faith traditions. And so the challenge is much more how we can get these people to be able to articulate well when they are facing and servicing their communities, that they have good answers for the problems and issues that are raised by their congregations and members of their faith traditions. That's the main point. And I think that was why we had chosen from the very beginning the religious extension officers to be our carriers of our messages. You know?
Now the question from Daniel Sutami. Thank you, Pak Diki. Why the term being used is religious literacy? Why not interreligious literacy?
Yeah, this is very interesting. And you see, within the body of knowledge about religious literacy, it is already inherent that there is interreligious dimension to it. Yeah. As I mentioned, this is not learning religions or studying religion or teaching religion, but it's teaching about religion, studying about religion, learning about religion. Yeah. So religion being a social fact of life, religion being part and parcel of the reality of life. You know, and when you think about that, then you know that there is not only one religion. Of course, one can argue that religion is a singular phenomenon. I mean, that's fine with me, right? But the expressions and manifestations of religion could be in multiplicity, right? And hence the idea within Pancasila that is unity in diversity, right? So Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. So e pluribus unum. So the many, one, right? So within the notion of religious literacy, there is interreligious literacy there, right? As I mentioned, if you learn religion, yeah, or if you learn about religion, then you must come out of your shell, and you have to have that same passion and enthusiasm to learn about other religions as well. So this is why I guess the main concept is not interreligious literacy, yeah, but rather religious literacy. And as I mentioned, this came out of the very generic term of literacy, which then, evolved to include cultural literacy and then religious literacy. Yeah, you'll find this in my article as well. But I take your point that yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe in 5-10 years down the line, there will be a scientific discussion on the notion of interreligious literacy, where the emphasis would be more about learning the the basic frameworks and understanding about other religions, because the assumption might be that you already know about your own religious tradition.
Right. Are there still people who want to ask here? Or perhaps I can follow up some of the questions from Mas Anju earlier about how the training deals with some sensitive issues, and I would define conservatism as something like a position that people may hold in terms of, for example, in the case of religion-state relation. If someone is saying that a non-Muslim cannot lead a Muslim majority country, that would count as conservative, right? And that would be an example of a sensitive or contentious issue. How would the module that ICRS was making, or the training that was done by ICRS is dealing with this issue and explain the issue to the extension officers. I would like to know how is the demography or the dominant view among those penyuluh agama, whether most of them are conservatives or moderate, to use the term that is used by the Ministry of Justice. Everybody.
Thank you for the follow-up question. Well, I guess to say that Indonesia is heading toward conservatism, or is already becoming a conservative state, is already a truism, I guess, right? Ever since the work of, I guess, Rickleff, and then Homayotsu, and Martin van Vunissen and others. And I think the latest book by Leonard Sebastian et al., I think also talks about Islamic conservatism in Indonesia taking root, which I think the argument essentially is saying that we are going away from our sort of religious diversity, religious pluralism, social imaginary, if you like, and even the ideology of Pancasila and Bhinneka Tunggal Ika and all, and that we are becoming much more attuned to the identity politics that is engulfing many parts of the world today. And I think that is very hard to disprove, I think. And if you look at the latest work by our friends from the Islamic University in Jakarta, PPIM, I was involved in their workshops on the research design. They developed this research, this massive research on beragama di media sosial, right? Essentially being religious in the social media. And so they looked into millions of data sets using data scientists to analyze from something like 7.5 tweets and from at least 500,000 Twitter accounts and YouTubes and so on and so forth. And, their data set, which I just presented last week in Bali, does confirm that the conservatism does not only happen in meat space, but also is happening in cyberspace, in social media. And in fact, we have identified some of the issues and the topics and the subjects that were discussed among the people, the Muslims and the religious people in social media, to determine some of the most talked about or chatted about in social media. And it does confirm our hypothesis that at least in social media, that most of the users of social media, at least from Twitter and YouTube, that around 67% of Indonesian social media users are conservatives. That is the environmental factor that I was talking to you about earlier, or the context in which we are operating in. And so the idea of the religious literacy is how we can mitigate that problem, if it does create problems, right? Because for some people in the higher up of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, they might not see this necessarily as a problem. They might see conservatism as one of the features of religion, one of the features of Islam, one of the features of Christianity, Catholicism, and so on, right? So you can't really separate religiosity and conservatism. So there is an argument about that as well, and this of course relates to not only interpretation, tafsir, hermeneutics, but also how people decide on everyday decisions, how they make everyday decisions in life, right? So for instance, would you want to send your child, if you were a Muslim, would you care to send your child to a Christian school, for instance, to a Catholic school, for instance, right? Or would a Christian send their sons and daughters to a Muhammadiyah school, for instance, right? So these are some of the sort of everyday issues that people of faith face and confront and must deal with, right? And this is where the religious literacy comes in, right? So essentially saying that it's fine for you, you know, as long as you can still retain your basic commitments to your faith, right? But of course, others would disprove that and would argue otherwise, and that's also fine. But I mean, conceptually and theoretically, this goes back to the issue by Wagner concerning the environmental factors. Yeah, if you were to look at the religious literacy program in the US, for instance, or even, you know, studies on religious literacy by people like Diane Eck and others at Harvard and other schools, you see this pervasive Christian privilege within the context of America, right? And because it's in your face, because most people there are Christians, they don't feel like that's a privilege, right? And I guess this is this in line with this whole sort of political fiasco and discussion with Donald Trump about white privilege and so on and so forth, right? Because if it's imbued in society, if it's everywhere, then people would tend not to notice it, right? So it's like the invisible gorilla phenomenon. It's there, but you don't see it, right? The same thing with a lot of Muslims here, right? We say that, you know, Indonesia is a negara Pancasila, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, and so on. But there's a lot of Muslim privilege in our society. And if you look at the Kementerian Agama, certainly there is Muslim privilege there. You know, there is a whole Director General at the Echelon 1 level for Haji, for Umrah, right? And then there's a whole lot of subsidy for Islamic universities, for madrasas, for pesantrens, and so on and so forth. You have the zakat, infaq, sadaqah as well, and so on and so forth, right? So there is that pervasive Muslim privilege in Indonesia. And I think when we are talking about religious literacy, we need to be aware of this, right? Because we need to understand how non-Muslims see this, right? So the Muslims might not be able to see this, but non-Muslims would obviously see this. And this is where the context and the environmental factor in religious literacy programs anywhere would be quite instrumental to be considered, yeah, and very important to be considered. And this, I'm saying this because this also is in relation to how the Ministry of Religious Affairs operate, right? Because like other ministries, you know, they go by certain what we call state management of funds, right? Keuangan negara. And for those who don't know, the Ministry of Religious Affairs has the number 3 or number 4 most, you know, highest national budget allocation after the Ministry of Defense and Public Works, Police. That's the Ministry of Religious Affairs, right? So we're talking about a lot of money. But if you consider the research, development, and education training agency there, and what do you see? Yeah, you have around what, maybe 150 to 200 so-called researchers, but there is not one non-Muslim there, except one lady who just came on board, who just graduated from CRCS, who specifically made the plea to move from Medan from North Sumatra to go to Jakarta to become the first non-Muslim researcher within the Ministry of Religious Affairs, right? So what I'm talking about here is about resources, yeah, in terms of money allocation and in terms of expertise, right? So if you have 200 researchers who are all Muslims, yeah, what do you expect of the research being done on, religions other than Islam, right? Like Christianity, like Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and even others who are not categorized or not seen as, formal religions or religions that are being serviced by the state, right? So obviously there is a problem there. And so we are still a long way to go in terms of having that sufficient level of religious literacy.
There is another question from Ustad Liaquat Ali, but via direct message to me. I do not fully understand the question, but Ustad Liaquat, if you don't mind, you could speak directly. I will just read your questions here. If I may add into the explanation, I understand the part you explained on the lecture that will impart the knowledge. May I know who are the audiences? Are there any reason for this? And do you have a list? I look forward for your sharing on this, especially the book that you are coming up with. Can you answer this, Pak Diki? Or Ustad Liaquat, if you don't mind, you may speak with a video to now.
Go ahead, Ustad, tafadhal.
Okay. All right. Okay, that's good. Can everybody hear me? Good. Prof, I understand that there will be people that is imparting the knowledge of religious literacy. So do you have audience, or you have already sourced out for audience, like schools, like prisons, or wherever that you are imparting this this whole module? That's what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just give you a quick answer to that one. We have a very long question after this, but our main target initially for our program was the religious extension officers. Yeah, what we had in mind initially was to have mostly religious extension officers plus. That was the idea, and the plus would constitute the NGO activists, religious communities, religion teachers, women's leaders, youth leaders, and so on, so that they can also be exposed to our program. But apparently the Ministry of Religious Affairs wasn't able to sort of accommodate that too much. And again, this is because of the resources, right? So one of the things I learned about how the ministry operate is that they can only operate and serve the 6 religions that we know, right? So apart from that, they really don't have much resources to give. So when it comes to inviting audiences or members of the communities from specific religions and so on, that must be justified by way of the what we call tupoksi, the main vision, mission, and work within the ministry. Because not going by the tupoksi would mean maladministration and corruption. So we are dealing with a bureaucracy. Yeah? We are dealing with a resource wealthy institution, but at the same time tied to very stringent laws on anti-corruption, on maladministration, and so on and so forth. So that is that has become one of the main challenges that we have faced. It's not for the schools. It's mostly for the religious extension officers, but they alone are quite big, right? As I mentioned, there are 115,000 religious extension officers across the archipelago at the sub-district level. So we are talking about, almost perhaps half of the stadium of Senayan being filled by religious extension officers from all around Indonesia. It's funny that you mentioned prisons, because right after finishing the religious literacy program, I was also invited to give training for juvenile delinquents in 4 or 5 or 6 prisons in Sumatra, in Lampung, Palembang, Riau, and so on. And this was also supported by the British Council, and the person who organized this, in fact, had told me that he was inspired by our religious literacy program because he had participated in it and, got his inspiration from our religious literacy program. So I did do something like a religious literacy program for around maybe, I would imagine 200 to 300 juvenile delinquents. But obviously I did this via Zoom because it was already in the middle of the pandemic in, I think, August or September 2020. There's a
question here
from Asep.
Mas Asep Supianuddin from Win Sunan Kalijaga, Sunan Gunung Jati, Bandung, asks about, and it is about how religious literacy is going to deal with the issue on Christmas greetings. Some people allow it, some Muslims do not allow it, and how would the training on religious literacy will take on this issue?
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of problems and issues that we try to tackle in our religious literacy programs. So we try to sort of anticipate such dilemmas and questions, because as you know, in Indonesia, every year around maybe the 2nd or 3rd week of December, there would constantly be people, coming up with fatwas and hadith and Quranic verses saying, how it is impermissible or haram for Muslims to, congratulate their Christian brothers and sisters on Christmas Day or something, right? So, and we had anticipated this, and we in fact dealt with some of these issues during our content development workshop. So we try to tease out with all of our informants and experts from different faith traditions and different geographic provinces to give us some of the more idiosyncratic problems as well and issues in each places. For instance, in Ambon, for instance, there are some parameters that we were asked not to go beyond, because then that would stimulate some negative responses from people who are still trying to heal from the wounds of the conflict between the Muslims and Christians there. And in North Sumatra, for instance, there were also advisory for us trainers, for instance, to not use Assalamualaikum to those who are non-Muslims, for instance, and so on. So we took note of all of these issues, and tried to sort of prepare our trainers to be on the lookout for some of these very highly sensitive issues. And so, yes, we did encounter some of these problems and issues, but I think in general, there weren't any violent reactions to any of our trainings that we did in any of the provinces, except for some high-pitched voices that came out during some of the questions and answer sessions during these session trainings. I think Michael has a question.
I do. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Actually, even more your comments since the presentation, because I've seen the presentation before. But what you said since has been, I learned a lot. I mean, for example, the budget of the Affairs Department. I mean, when you look at the problems in this country, the development, well, they call it development. I need to turn off their video, their sound. It's me. I think it's Suyan Ningsi Mila. Can you please turn off your microphone?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. There are so many problems in this country which are to do with very basic access to clean water, sewage, even nutritious food in some of the outlying islands, that the government is spending so much on religious affairs, which is nearly all going to one faith group, is really astonishing to me. I didn't know this. But I have a particular question to you. It's not meant to be a trick question, but I'm going to ask it in a way that will build up. So the first question is this: do you think someone is religiously literate if they cannot understand their own scriptures in their own language?
Oh, you're asking me now?
Yes, I'm asking you now. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Supposing you have a British Christian and they only have access to the Greek New Testament and they cannot read or understand New Testament in Greek. Would that person, in your view, be religiously literate?
Yeah, this is one of the questions that we have been trying to think for ourselves, you know, and the idea of religious literacy is, again, to have that respect and appreciation for diversity. That's why the idea is not, as I mentioned, learning religion or studying religion, but studying about religion, meaning to say religion as more of a social fact in life and a reality that we must confront, right? And it's just like, to me, when I reflect on my own experience in the British public school, when I go to my religious education subject classes, it's like going to the physical education classes, right? The physical education classes has football, has cricket, has basketball, and so on. And we cannot be, the teachers will not expect you to be able to be good at everything, right? To be good at basketball.
I don't really want to talk about Britain. I want to talk about Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yeah. So, what I'm saying is I'm reflecting this on my own personal experience, which means, but you have to have some level and to be able to play basketball and some level of football and cricket. And so the same thing in my reflection of this religious literacy is that if you are a Muslim and you have already memorized the Quran and Hadith, to me, that is not enough, right? This is my argument.
Just for those who are listening who may not know the reason for my question.
Yeah, to me.
Can I just finish my question now? Because I want to follow up. So some people may not know, because I didn't know for some years. I lived in Malaysia for 5 years, and it only hit me about halfway through that Quranic classes did not involve learning the Quran in the person's own language. In other words, all that the children were doing when they went to Quranic classes was learning the Arabic script and to repeat it by rote and even chant it. But they were never taught what it meant. And therefore, in Malaysia, I don't know what happens in Indonesia, you can tell me, but in Malaysia, the government wrote all the sermons. So the government determined what people understood Islam meant, because they could not read the Quran for themselves. They could not understand it. So I come back to my question: is somebody religiously literate who does not understand the text of their own religion?
Well, based on my definition of religious literacy, yes, he or she could be considered as religious.
They could be religiously literate if they did not understand their own religious doctrines and teachings. Yeah,
anything about the religious teachings or doctrines or theologies of other religions. I mean, if
I don't forget other religions. I'm just talking about Muslims and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a Muslim who cannot understand the Quran, is that person literate in their own religion?
Look, I mentioned.
That's a question.
Yeah. I mentioned.
I don't really want a yes/no answer. It only really has a yes, no
Note
answer.
of my earlier presentation, when I define religious literacy, I said traditionally, when people say religious literacy, it means the knowledge of the text. That was what I had said.
Yes, but
Right?
you used the word knowledge, but you didn't say whether the knowledge included the ability to know what Arabic words mean in your own
that
native
was the
language.
derivative issue.
It's not derivative at all, because
I mean,
if you have an imam who tells you, your government minister,
Professor Northcott, would you please make Patiki to
but
finish
I don't think
his
it's
answer
derivative.
first?
do you really have to be a good Christian to know, let's say, Aramaic? Do you really have to be a good Jew, right, or be able to practice Judaism and have full command of, Ibrani language, right?
No, you don't. That's the whole point.
Exactly.
Because Christians teach the Bible in English.
Exactly. That's what I meant to say when I said that religious literacy previously meant the knowledge about the text, the scripture. That is the standard basic definition. What I'm saying is that my religious literacy program is not about that, Michael. That's what I'm saying. That's the whole presentation about. It's not about learning your own scriptures and learning your own sacred texts. That's the whole idea of this presentation and this research.
I know,
So I think you can read my paper on that, because there is that discussion on how I define religious literacy and how it has evolved through time, you see. That was one of the reasons why I asked Aziz, would it be appropriate to ask all of the participants of the Wednesday Forum to read ahead of my article so that they can get a basic understanding of how I argued on religious literacy.
Can I just add, you see, in the Middle Ages in Britain, the situation was very similar to what it is in many Muslim countries today. But the only people who knew what the scriptures meant, because they were all available only in Latin, were the priests. So the priest would stand up on Sunday and say, the scripture says you're all going to die from the plague tomorrow if you don't lock yourselves in your houses. Well, they could say what they liked, and nobody knew whether it was true or not. And then Martin Luther came along in the 16th century, and he translated the Bible into German and created a revolution. And many of the texts and many of the assumptions we make as academics in ICRS and CRCS are based on that revolution, which is that literacy in terms of knowing what concepts are, understanding them in your own language is foundational to even our academic culture. So I'm sorry to keep repeating the question, but I didn't see in the article, and I didn't see in the presentation, the discussion of what to me is the most fundamental issue about religious literacy. Yeah. And the biggest difference, also the biggest diversity, if you to use your language, between Christianity and Islam is that Christians assume that if you don't understand a phrase like Jesus Christ is Lord, you aren't a Christian because you can't say it in a way that's meaningful. Just repeating it in Greek would not make you a Christian.
Well, we have a lot of translations in Bahasa Indonesia, Quran, but I guess to a certain extent, we also differ in terms of how we read and treat the scripture. As you probably know, the Quran to us, to Muslims, is the word of God, right? I mean, verbatim word of God, meaning to say there is a special place for people who memorize the Quran, who know its inherent and intrinsic meanings, and know the occasion of the revelation or the asbabun nuzul of each and every one of the verses and so on and so forth, right? But then the question is everyone expected to become an alim? Is everyone expected to become ulama, right? I don't think that was the main purpose of the revelation. I don't think that was the main purpose of religion in the first place, right? You can't expect everyone to become experts of religion or to become a fuqaha, right? A faqih, right? Somebody who is well versed in Islamic jurisprudence and so on, right? So you leave some of these to the specialists, right? But we are talking about a religious literacy program that is somewhat different. And as I mentioned, the definition and application of religious literacy has evolved. It's no longer this knowledge and ability and competence to translate and to interpret the sacred text. It's not just that. so the meaning has evolved, and this is what I'm saying, and this is what I've been trying to argue, that we have a different kind of religious literacy program. Now, if you disagree that this is a religious literacy program, then by all means, you know, you can always criticize my paper, but this is how I view religious literacy in the context of Indonesia.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
There's more to discuss.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe over
$1 billion.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Diki. It's already almost 2:30, and we don't have enough time. We don't have much time any longer for discussion. So I think we can end this for today at this point. Once again, thank you so much for Yes Center and all the participants who have asked and comment. For the next week, we will still have another Wednesday forum with the speaker being Julie Kailas from Los Angeles, California. She is a guest candidate in culture and performance art. She will be speaking about women leaders in Nusantara in Indonesia. So I hope that you can join again next week, and yeah, stay safe and healthy. And
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.